Welcome back to Reluctant Preppers. We have a very new kind of a topic tonight. It's not an expert of the kind that we've usually had on, but this is a real life, real world individual who's walked the walk, made the hard choices, learned a lot, and together with his wife and family has made the move from city life to self-sufficient living in the country. This is Gus from Idaho. He's gone all the way from the Border Patrol of Texas, where he was a member of the private border patrol in Texas, priced out of city living by the high cost of organic food for his special needs family members, moved out of there and searched for a home in a location where he could get 4 strong seasons with lots of opportunities for hunting, fishing, food growing, a good water supply, and a low-toxin environment. He narrowed his search to the Northwest U.S. and found out the right property through the right kind of connections he was able to make there, and has transformed that new place into just right for his family. He's here with us to talk about his experience and the lessons he's learned along the way so that we can all benefit from it.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back to Reluctant Preppers. We're trying something new tonight, a brand new chapter for us. We're calling it Home Sweet Prepared Home Stories, and it's going to be interviews not with world-renowned experts, as we've often done on other topics in the past, but this is with ordinary people like you and me who have made steps in their lives to take on preparedness, self-sufficiency, and self-reliance, and are going to share their stories with our viewers so that we can all learn from things that went well, things they would have done differently, and some of the best tips that they've picked up along the way. And hopefully we'll all be inspired and encourage and strengthen each other along the way. So this is an invitation to any of you who feel inspired in listening to this story and who might want to approach me to go ahead and email us at reluctantpreppers@gmail.com if you'd like to be potentially interviewed as your testimony and your story in the future. So tonight we're speaking with our first guest, who is Gus from Idaho. Gus, thank you for joining us this first time on Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
You, as I understand, have been following our channel for some time, and I'm glad to hear that, and I hope you've been getting lots of good out of it. I know I have from all the things that I've been learning from our guests along the way, and one of the voices that we'd like to hear more of is from common people who have actually done the steps and made the changes in their lives. You and I have conversed some by phone, some by email. You'd shared with me your story of how you and your wife made some major life changes and relocated. So in a nutshell, could you maybe give us at a very high level an understanding of where you were coming from that kind of got you concerned about a desire or a longing or a need to become more self-reliant in the first place?
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question, an excellent place to start. And, as you mentioned, I have been a listener for quite some time and truly enjoyed the experts that you had on there, and, had contemplated on reaching out to you for quite a while, and then something just kind of came over me to go ahead and do it. So I'm really glad that you're doing this. And, as you said, I really hope that this can be a new kind of a phase that you go into to help other people as they share their ideas and their situations and their successes and their trials and tribulations. And so, with that said, I grew up in the Chicagoland area, moved to Texas shortly after getting married in my early to mid-30s, and after 9/11, we had twins, and both of my twins were diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And so for me, that was kind of a real eye-opening experience. Up until that point, I had been, your typical suburban kid that grew up in the suburbs in the 60s and really had all my life been told, work hard, do your job, come home every day, take care of your your family and all is well. And well, the day that we found out that our twins were both diagnosed on the autism spectrum, it became very clear that all was not well. And so what it did was it led me down a very long and deep rabbit hole, so to speak, because at that point I began, researching things that I had just taken for granted all my life, like food labeling and,
Right.
just all kinds of different things like, fluoride in the water and things of that nature. And so it was a process, but that is what kicked off the process.
Interesting. And in addition to that, you mentioned that there were some financial setbacks and things that shook your world financially as a family that got you really questioning the stability or even the truthfulness of our whole business climate, our whole financial environment.
Yeah. My background is I graduated in Illinois with majors in accounting and business administration, and I was a CPA. And I had spent about 15 years practicing as a CPA. And when we moved to Texas for business reasons, I got involved in corporate finance and corporate finance consulting. And so once I got to Texas, I started doing a lot more research on the economy, on monetary policy, because I had to do that for my clients and for my work. I mean, I was no longer preparing financial statements and tax returns. I was now giving clients financial advice. And as a result of that, I started seeing a lot of the things that, that are talked about by many of your professionals and experts that are on your program. But in the beginning, I really didn't pay a lot of attention to it. I was kind of like, keep your head down, keep working. And then, after 9/11, I practically lost my entire life savings. And I thought, well, we'll just rebuild and regroup and go on. And then, of course, in 2004, the twins were diagnosed with the autism diagnosis, and there was a significant financial setback in treatments and fighting with insurance companies and all of that. And so, between 2004 and 2008, we were able to kind of get back to a level of normalcy. But then the financial crisis of '08 was kind of like, that was like the real eye opener. And that was at the point where, I began realizing that, these business cycles and these things that are happening, are not just random and they're not just happenstance. And I better start looking at things a little bit differently, because my ability to continue to earn an income was going down significantly after each financial crisis. And so, I found myself in 2009, 10, and 11 making a fraction of what I was making prior to that. And so it was a significant life-altering situation. And as you get older, you think to yourself, am I going to be able to keep working harder and making less money? And at some point you realize that the trend is not your friend. I mean, the ability to continue to earn is going down, and the amount of time you're having to spend in order to make less money is going up. And so, after 2008, 2009, 10, it became clear to me that there was a paradigm shift, and that I started, looking a lot more closely at some of these economic factors, digging in more deeply into the Federal Reserve and what was going on. All of a sudden, Austrian economics versus Keynesian economics became a lot more than just two different schools of thought or two different theories. It was something that I was beginning to realize was affecting my life and my family's lives.
So when you were having these hard times that you were going through after the 2008 collapse and struggling in your business and your financial lives, and realizing that there was something rotten in the financial system that wasn't going to get better anytime soon, what led you from there into also seeking out a different location? You mentioned Texas, so what was it that you were plugged into that was working for you well in Texas, and where were the gaps? Do you feel like, this just really isn't right for us, and I really need to look for something different?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. The first thing that happened was, 2010 and 11, when I realized and started having conversations with my wife about the fact that this was the new reality, and not to back up, but just so you know, after 9/11, I had lost our life savings in the stock market, and then I thought, well, gee, I just won't do that again. I'll put all my money into real estate. And so we were putting money into real estate, and we were buying, rental properties, and we had purchased an office building, and then, of course, in the '08 crisis, the value of all of our real estate went down significantly. So I found myself financially where the cash flow wasn't, nowhere near what it was prior to that. And so the first decision that we had to make was, do we stay where we're at and try and downsize and or regroup and retool in Texas by simply moving out of town, moving out of the city limits, and finding a place where we could begin to start, providing for our children, because at that point, the cost of, for example, buying organic food and things of that nature was going significantly higher. And so we're making less money. The costs are going up. Our daughter had been recovered, but our son was still, on the autism spectrum. And in fact, he's pretty severe. And so it became more important for me to be able to, find a place where I could, what I would call source organic food. And the cost of doing so in town was prohibitive. It was getting very expensive. We were spending thousands of dollars a month just on food for our son, not to mention therapies and doctors' bills and things of that nature. And so the first decision was, do we stay in Texas or do we look somewhere else? And my wife really wanted to stay in Texas. And so I said, okay, we'll stay in Texas. We'll give it a shot. And for the next 2 to 3 years, I decided that we were going to try and stay where we're at, try to get involved in the community, join the Tea Party, joined a private border protection group. So I would go down on the border and help, patrol property for the individuals that lived down there and had ranches down there. And we just, were trying to see if we could make it work where we were at. And, right around 2012, 2013, of course, right before the election, my thought was, maybe if President Obama doesn't win re-election, that things might change financially. So we stuck it out for those 4 years. And it was tough because we were having to, move things around. We had to sell things and we had to do things just to stay where we were at. And when President Obama won re-election in 2012, it was kind of like psychologically, it was a death knell to us, because I just felt that I couldn't do it for 4 more years. I couldn't, stay where we were at, continue to pay what we were paying for, for food and property taxes and all the things that we had committed to when we were making significantly more money for another 4 years. And so in 2013, we decided that we were going to explore other locations.
When you made the decision to look for another location, what were the main themes, the main criteria that you were focused on, and what resources did you use that really helped guide you and assist you in finding matches for what you were looking for?
Very good question. Obviously, the most important factor was our son. And as you can imagine, during this time, my wife had been a member of an autism support group, and she had gone to a lot of the autism conferences and had gotten very deeply connected into that community. And so when we sat down and said, okay, here are the criteria that we have to have in order to provide an environment for our son that is most conducive to his recovery. And that, led me to, I have to have fresh water. I had to have the ability to raise animals. I had to have the ability to grow a garden. I had to be somewhere near, national forest or state forest where I could, could hunt and possibly be able to, hunt, fish, grow, and raise most, if not all, of the food that we were going to be eating. So that was criteria number one, and it pretty much, that's the hub, and then all the spokes came out from there. And so once we realized that, we kind of got out a map, and we said, well, for us, having grown up in the Midwest, I think it needs to be in an area where there's 4 seasons. Obviously there are problems in certain places like Arizona. They have problems with water. California is out of the question politically, financially, every other way. And so we did that, and we just kind of narrowed it down. And one night I was on the internet searching, and I came across a website where there was a map of the United States where it listed, or it showed, the levels of glyphosate, which is the main ingredient in Roundup.
Mm-hmm.
And so that pretty much, that narrowed our search down pretty good. That narrowed it down to about 4 or 5, maybe 6 states where we felt that, the levels of glyphosate were low enough to where it would not be something that could be detrimental to our son, because we didn't want those chemicals getting into the groundwater, and then the groundwater, coming into our home through either city water or through well water.
Mm-hmm.
And so we ended up with Colorado, Utah, basically everything north of New Mexico, west of the Dakotas, Wyoming, all of those states, Montana. And one, that was kind of like our original geographic constraints. And then we started searching from there, looking at other criteria, the political environment. One of the things that was critical for us was we had to go to a state where, there were vaccine exemptions. Having done all that research about our son and getting his medical records, and, from 2004 to 2013, as you can imagine, we had accumulated a lot of information, and we had done, many blood tests and things of that nature. So we knew that, we knew what his problems were, and we knew where we had to be, so to speak. And last but not least, one of the priests at our church was relocated to western Montana, Missoula, Montana. And he had come back for a visit, and we had a long conversation with him about, western Montana. And so our initial search started in Montana, and that's where, that's where we kind of started.
It seems either amazingly coincidental, or that your research just happened to lead you right to the same neck of the woods that James Rawls has identified and dubbed the American Redoubt, that collection of about approximately 5 states in the northwestern U.S. Were you aware of James Rawls's work at that time, or had read anything of his books, or did this just happened to be that your analysis led you to the exact same area?
Yeah, I hadn't heard of him, didn't know. As you can imagine, I'd spent my days and nights, working during the day, and at night I was, researching locations, and quote unquote wasn't, tuned into the prepper community at that point. But, I had, looked at the same criteria, natural disasters, proximity to military bases or installations, access to, the grid. What is it like? Is it hydroelectric, or is it, so all of those things, I kind of researched, and those are kind of my secondary criteria. But I did not have any knowledge of him, and did not know of him until after I moved up here.
as long as we're talking about the list of criteria that you and your wife had settled on, and you've mentioned these priorities, and maybe I'll include some of them that you shared with me in the notes under the video, so people can refer to some of the specific criteria that you were hoping for. But I'm curious if you could compare and contrast your priorities as father and husband and hers as mom and wife. Were there differences between you? Because a lot of the things that you emphasized in your notes that you wrote to me were heavily into the things that I typical would think is the sort of the masculine arts, the hunting, fishing, that kind of thing, the physical surroundings. Was she concerned about some of the other aspects as well?
Those aspects were kind of a secondary consideration for her because, having been born and raised in the city of Chicago, she was a little bit more of a city gal than I was, and than I am as a suburbanite guy. So, although I was not an expert at the time in things like hunting and fishing. I had fished when I was a kid and had begun hunting primarily because of the need. I felt that there was a need for me to be able to provide other sources of sustenance for our family in the event that a natural disaster occurred, or because I was seeing articles and seeing research in the news about how Congress was passing legislation to change the labeling laws, and I as a financial consultant, I had clients that were in the food preparation industry. One was a feedlot, and another one was a company that made food for cattle in the feedlot. And going out and visiting these businesses and seeing what was going on was kind of an eye-opening experience. And so I began.
Yeah, you literally got to see the belly of the beast. Yeah.
Yeah, and so my confidence in the quality of what was at the store was going down, whereas hers really wasn't. Because she was just of the mindset that, well, we'll just go to the grocery store and we'll buy organic. And I'm like, well, we can't, every year we really can't rely. It's getting worse and worse on our ability to rely on the fact that if you pick up a package of ground beef and it says grass fed, does that mean it was grass fed when it was owned by the rancher, but then not grass fed when it was sold to the feedlot? And what kind of chemicals and hormones and were pumped into that animal in order to make that animal heavier so that the feedlot can make a profit. And so her criteria were a little bit different than mine, but there was enough overlap to where, at the end of the day, we both, agreed that this is what needed to happen. And so she was, more along the lines of, I want to be outside of town, but really close to town so that I can get in the car and get to town really quickly. And I was like, I want to be as far in the woods as possible. The longer it takes to get to town, the better, And so on location, we definitely did meet halfway, so to speak. And so the property that we found is about 10 miles outside of town, but it's pretty deep in the mountain. But it's pretty easy to get down to the highway.
Yeah, could you take us into that next chapter of your adventure, which was, okay, so you're living there in Texas and you're saying, we've got to get to a different situation. You've narrowed it down to, say, 5 states or whatever. How in the world does someone on the other side of the country find that ideal location at a distance? What strategies did you use, and what hard lessons did you learn along that way, and what advice can you give, based on your experience? So if you can just kind of tell us how you go from the southern border of the U.S. to near the northern border and finding the right place.
Yeah, excellent question. Because at the beginning, I was going about it all wrong. I mean, so what I did was I said, well, I'll do my job during the day, and then at night I'll get on the internet and I'll just start searching on the internet for properties and, take a look at pictures and this, that, and the other. And, do I want acreage or do I want one with a house already on it? And so I kind of narrowed those things down. But what I found was that, after 3 or 4 months of doing that, I was really no closer than I was the day I started. And so it became clear to me that if I continued on this path, I was never going to find anything. So after several months of doing that, I realized I wasn't getting any closer, because what I would do is I would find a potential property or a potential house that was, desirable. And then when you started looking through the pictures, or if you got on Google Earth, you would find out that there was a railroad tracks going, right along the back of the property, or they were, 100 yards away from a junkyard, or, right. And so, one evening, I was on one of these websites, and I scrolled all the way down to the bottom, and I saw some advertisements for local preparedness-minded real estate agents. And that kind of led me down the path of thinking, well, I need to get somebody on the ground, on location, with a background in preparedness that I can give my criteria to, and they can, represent me and help me finding a location. And so that's what we did. And that was kind of a breakthrough for us, because once we did that and we found a gentleman, and, he was a retired Army Ranger, had lived, in the area for 30 years, had been a real estate agent for over 25 years. And when we talked to him on the phone, I was impressed in the fact that he would go out to the actual properties, and he would, do the research and make sure that there was 2 sources of water, and make sure that, all of the things necessary were there to be able to do what it is that I wanted to do once I got up to the property. And so we hired a gentleman, and he immediately said, well, have you thought about, North Idaho? And I said, well, no, because as far as I was concerned, there was nothing outside of Boise, that was inhabitable. And so he explained to me that's not the case. And so he started sending me some listings in the area. And he also did interview my wife. And so we did have several phone calls together, where he got her wants and needs, and he got my wants and needs, and he kind of put them together. And of course, we had to give him price range and what I was looking for in terms of number of acres and all of that. And so he put all that together, and he would start sending us, emails with a link to his website to show us listings that he thought were a good fit for us. And once we did that, it still took about another 6 months to get 3 properties that my wife and I could agree on that were worth looking at.
You mentioned earlier that you wanted someplace that had 4 seasons. So did you see these properties that you actually went, any properties that you actually went and viewed, did you see them under multiple seasons, or what season did you look at them in?
Well, it was just based on the timing of how everything unfolded. So I started looking, in January of 2014, and it was spring of 2015 before we got to the point where, we found those 3 properties that were on the market that were reasonably priced, that met most of our criteria. And so it just so happened that, that was March or April. And so, the reason why I wanted 4 seasons was because, there's a cleansing process that happens when there's a hard freeze. Mm-hmm. And, being down in Texas where it's warm all year round, you have things, there that you just don't have in an area where there's 4 seasons. Mm-hmm. And so that was my reason for that. I mean, like, for example, we have a well, and at any time of the year, the water coming out of the well into the house is, between 38 and 42 degrees. And so you just don't have bacteria, you don't have mold, you don't have things growing.
Right.
When water is that cold and it's running that swiftly.
So the other part of the question I was trying to get to was, did you view the property under different seasons, or you just saw it in the spring, made your selection, purchased it, so you only saw it in that one season?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Having grown up in the northern Midwest, I was familiar with, 4 seasons, and so was my wife. And so it wasn't something that, it's not like I was born and raised in California where I never felt a winter. It was, the purpose of it was, for rejuvenation of the ground, the earth, the water. I just felt that, it just was better for what I was going to do in terms of, growing my own food and having my own animals, that it was better to have 4 seasons.
Okay, another quick question is, you said we hired this guy and he did all this work for us. Was it actually like that kind of a contractor obligation where you actually hired him and he was working for you to go find the stuff? Or was it just he was a buyer's agent, and if you would buy a property, then he would get paid out of that?
Yeah, that's correct. He was a buyer's agent, but he represented buyers only. And so he actually interviewed us because he wanted to make sure that we were, Christian, conservative, like-minded. And he actually has on his website that he will not, represent liberals. And so, you don't want to have a scenario where, you represent someone, they buy a property, they go through the first winter and they realize that they can't handle it, and then they leave. Mm-hmm. And so he, after interviewing us and he agreed to represent us, then yeah, he was basically a buyer's broker, but his niche in the marketplace based on his military background was, a buyer's broker exclusively, and representing folks that are looking for preparedness properties in various stages of readiness.
Okay, I interrupted you. You were in the middle of telling us your story about the selection of your property, and you said one of the things you wanted to do is make sure you took a wide view of the surrounding area and make sure it didn't have any objectionable industries or that kind of thing around there, or neighbor land use that was going to be interfering with your quality of life. What else?
I guess one of the things that I didn't know up here was they have this thing called CC&Rs. I think it's covenants, contracts, and restrictions. And so, I had to, make sure that, that you weren't going to have to get a permit in order to, move some dirt around on your property. Or, like, for example, where I lived in Texas, you actually had to get permission from the city to cut down a tree on your property. And so, those were some of the other criteria that were important. Obviously, there had to be, certain services in town, because although I'm self-employed, I still had to work. I had to, move my business up here. And, I couldn't just, totally unplug overnight. And so, those are some of the other must-haves, so to speak, that we were looking at. And of course, our children were still of school age, and so we had to make sure that they had reasonable access to public schools and things of that nature.
You mentioned in your story that you shared with me about some real fortunate situation with the seller of the property that you were looking at, as far as having some equipment that was really valuable to you too.
Yeah. What I would say is that, as I mentioned to you previously, is that, once you go through this process and you find a general area that you think you're going to want to relocate to, you really need to do some research on what I call the lay of the land. And, because we were moving up into the Rockies, I mean, it really meant that if you were going to do what it is that I want to do, you had to have some heavy equipment. And these are the things that I didn't even bother to ask the real estate agent. Are there equipment rental companies in town? How rocky is the soil? if I'm going to be putting up an orchard or bushes, berry bushes, or digging a garden, how is that going to happen? What tools do I need to get that to work? And so, yeah, I got real lucky in that the gentleman and his wife that owned the property that we bought, they were moving back to California to be with their children and grandchildren. And so he had accumulated quite a bit of equipment and tools and things of that nature that he wasn't going to be taking with him because he was moving to a house on the ocean or something, where he just wasn't going to need any of that stuff. And so I went there after we had signed the contract. And as we were going through the process of getting the paperwork done and mortgage and secured and things of that nature, I actually went back out there to visit with him, and we kind of walked the property, and, he asked me, do you want to buy this? Do you want to buy this? And so I ended up purchasing, a skid steer, a plow truck, riding lawnmower with a 42-inch brush mower attachment, and, all the things that he was using in order to be able to maintain the property. And had I not done that, it would have set back my progress significantly, because I did not realize how rocky it was up there until I got up there. And obviously that's something that you can't put a shovel in the ground until you own it, so to speak. And so I was very fortunate in that, because I had no clue that it was going to be as difficult as it was, just to dig a hole in the ground. I mean, literally, when I put in my orchard, I had to uproot, 6 trees. And then in order to be able to plant 8 fruit trees, I had to rent an excavator, and I had to dig 13 holes in order to get, 6 or 8 of them that were deep enough to where I could plant a tree. Because I just came across so many rocks, boulders, I'm talking huge boulders, that it made it almost impossible.
I guess they call it the Rocky Mountains for a reason, huh?
Yeah. And we kind of live up on a ridge, and so there's a big drop off on one side of the property. And so, obviously some of the things that I would recommend if you're going to go through that process is, definitely you want to walk the property. One of the things that we did that was good was we made arrangements when I went out there for the homeowners to not be there. And I literally spent half a day, just me and the real estate agent, walking around the property, going through the barn, looking in the shop, checking out, the water, the well, things of that nature. Not for like inspection purposes, because obviously you hire an inspector to do that, but to just try and, figure out, can I plant a garden here, or do I got to put it over there? Where's a greenhouse going to go? All of the things that, that you don't think about, they could really become problematic if you go ahead and go to closing without looking at any of that information.
Right, and water is so critical. You mentioned so many needs for healthy living and healthy food and that sort of thing. I haven't heard you mention about air quality. I imagine that's part of what your criteria were, as well as the water quality in the land for hunting and fishing, that sort of thing. But what did you do to make sure that the water quality was going to be sufficient for you?
Well, primarily we relied on the real estate agent, and initially the house that we purchased, he basically said no, because I had found it on, I don't know, it was like realtor.com or something, and I said, how about this property? And he said, no, that part of the mountain has a reputation for not having water. And so I asked him, I said, well, could you go up there and just look? And he went up there, and it turned out that was true. I mean, that area of the mountain had a reputation for having problems with water, not sufficient water for irrigation, because his criteria was you have to have 2 sources of water, one for drinking and one for irrigation. And but it just so happened that particular property had a underground spring going through it, and the prior owner had tapped into it and put a big holding tank, and so there was plenty of water for irrigation. And so he came back, and then that one was on the list simply because, it had the water. And it's funny, as it relates to the air quality, I'll kind of back up and say that was one of the reasons that we decided to leave Texas, because what had happened was we had purchased a brand new house, new construction. We get in there 3 months later, the CEO of the DFW airport is elected mayor of the town. And I swear within 3 weeks, planes were flying over our house like every 45 seconds. So apparently they had, after the election, they had changed the flight pattern, and they had allowed, they started allowing planes to come in, and they were going right over the house. And
wow.
I remember being very upset about that because of my son. And then that 6 months later, they actually constructed a electrical transfer station that was so close. It was right outside the subdivision, but you could literally, take a 9-iron and shoot a golf ball and from my back porch, and you could hit this transfer station. And so those were the things that kind of pushed us into leaving. So getting to an area that was far enough outside of town and, kind of up in the mountains, I assumed that the air quality would be better than where we currently were in Texas.
A big theme that came out in your story that you shared with me was about hunting and gun ownership and so on. Can you talk to us about what, if any, of that factored into your location that you chose?
It did, because we ended up settling on a 10-acre parcel, and the other two properties of the three that we had narrowed it down to, both of them had a border that butted up against the national forest. And so what I wanted was the ability to, leave my property and go right into the forest so that I could get access to some of the more difficult locations, which are easier to hunt than if you have to go in, by public egress. And so, but I wasn't a hunter prior to my son being diagnosed. Once it became clear that we were going to have to start, raising our own food, one of the ways in which, I felt that was going to be done was, by going out and hunting. And so, I was quote unquote a reluctant hunter because I didn't know anything about it. But luckily for me, I had a dear friend, and I still have this dear friend down in Texas who was an avid bow hunter. And so, I immediately, said to him, I said, look, can you kind of teach me how to hunt? And so we went out, and he got me a bow, and we started hunting. And it was one of those things that, obviously, once you try it, you like it. And so when we were looking at locations, all of the locations were locations that had to have access to, deer, elk, sheep, things of that nature. And, everything pretty much up here in the inland Pacific Northwest is very conducive to that. And obviously Montana, Idaho, Colorado, Wyoming, all of those states are good hunting states.
And in addition to that, the gun ownership, anything about the state selection that you use as your criteria about ability to do the hunting, the activities that you wanted to do, that sort of thing?
Yeah, and that kind of overlapped with the political considerations, and so obviously, quickly Colorado was eliminated. The state of Washington was eliminated. Oregon, I really didn't spend any time doing any real research on Oregon, but in hindsight, Oregon was eliminated primarily due to its political environment, but obviously gun ownership and politicians' perception of gun ownership is a big part of that, political environment. And so, Idaho is extremely Second Amendment friendly. It's a Second Amendment or constitutional carry states. And so, yeah, for me, I love bow hunting, but rifle hunting was a reality because, it's just far more difficult to bow hunt. And so I kind of tell folks that I bow hunt for pleasure and I rifle hunt for putting meat in the freezer. And so at that time, I literally had, I was always, pro Second Amendment, but I really wasn't deeply into gun ownership. And so, at the time that I decided that I had to move in this direction, I literally only owned one handgun and didn't own any rifles. And so, like everything else, I started doing the research. I started figuring out how to go about this process of, developing, I don't want to say a collection, but developing a variety of weapons that were going to be for a purpose. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to just collect guns for the sake of, bragging about how big my gun safe was. And so for me, it was really important to be able to have firearms that I could work on, that I could fix if something broke, and have an array of firearms that were going to be able to cover all of my needs. And so, for example, small game, predators, large game, as well as self-protection and family protection. And mm-hmm. And so once I found out what kind of animals were up here, because you have to protect yourself from, up here there's grizzly bear, black bear, mountain lion, coyotes, bobcats, and so you're either protecting yourself or your animals that you're raising, from these various, natural predators that are in the area. And so as a result of that, I developed my array of weapons to be able to cover all of those needs and do it in a way as efficiently as possible, because I came to the conclusion, for a lot of reasons, including political reasons, that I wanted to be able to not only have firearms that I quote unquote built, but also be able to reload ammunition and have the ability to see to it that I can have sufficient ammunition to take care of all of those needs. So, for example, I didn't buy a weapon chambered in a caliber unless I knew that caliber could be used either in another weapon. Like, for example, I have a revolver that's in a .357 Magnum, but I also have a lever action rifle that's in .357 Magnum. Mm-hmm. So when I reload, I'm reloading for two guns, not one. Mm-hmm. And what it does is it allows me to keep the number of types of ammunition that I have to reload for down to a minimum, but still have the ability to function and do all the things that I need to do in order to provide for and protect my family.
The reason you do reloading, is it primarily for the cost savings, or are there other benefits from your standpoint?
Yeah, there are other benefits. The cost benefit, sometimes, a certain ammunition can become very expensive depending on what's going on in the political world. As you can imagine, after Sandy Hook, the cost of .5.56 ammunition became very expensive, but then, later on it became very inexpensive. And so, what I tend to do is I buy, ammunition when it's inexpensive, but obviously you want to save the brass and you can reload that ammunition. But then when that particular caliber becomes expensive, then I switch over to reloading only. And so, as a result of that, it allows you to be able to practice more so that you can stay proficient with your firearms. And, and you don't have to spend a whole lot of money because of the political winds, so the cost of a .308 bullet, could double or triple or, whatever, just because of some political event that you had no idea was going to occur.
After you take down game for your gathering meat for your family, you shared in your story about some advances you made in your setup there on how you cure it, how you slaughter it, and so on. So, can you share just a few, maybe some best tips that you've adopted, you're glad about, that you do, that share with others?
Sure. For most folks, if you live in the suburbs or in the city, obviously, this is not an option for you, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to move into an area where I could do this. Was if you take your own game, it's always good to be able to age and cure and then butcher and then put that game in the freezer. So theoretically, you know exactly what that game has gone through from the time that you let go of the arrow or pull the trigger until it's actually cooked and on the table. And so for me, it was an evolving process. And so when I first moved up, for example, the first year that I raised chickens for meat, I took them to a local gentleman who, charges X number of dollars per chicken, and they butcher them, pluck them, and then you go back later in the day and you pick it up and your chicken is ready. And then that evolved to where I started doing that myself. And so and same thing with large game, initially, due to the weather up here, I was able to age deer and elk, in a side shop from my main shop. But there you're relying on the temperature, and if something happens where you get a warm day, it could cause problems. And so what I did was I eventually, I kept getting on Craigslist, and eventually somebody put up a walk-in cooler, and I went ahead and purchased that and, took it apart, brought it home, set it up, and now I'm, aging my own meat in my own walk-in cooler. So what that did, though, is that allowed me to be able to, for example, now I purchase beef, depending on, the situation, I'll buy either half a cow or a whole cow, 3/4 of a cow, from a rancher down the road. And we simply, he takes it to the meat processor and pays them a fee to kill it, skin it, gut it, quarter it, and then I go pick it up and I age it in my cooler. And so I'm able to save quite a bit of money, and then I don't have to pay the butcher to process it, and I can cut the meat the way that I like to cut it and the way that I know my family likes to eat it. And so it just makes for a better process, and not only is it more self-sustaining, but it's more satisfying, for the family.
Another aspect of the environment that you're targeting for your relocation site is the neighbors you're going to have. I mean, people always make this statement that you can't pick your neighbors, but how did that factor into you selecting the place that you ended up in? And in a sense, what qualities do you find particularly helpful or conducive, harmonious in your desire for self-reliance and self-sufficiency in the sort of the background and attitudes and skills of your current neighbors?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because remember when I came up here, I really wasn't preparedness minded. I was just solely focused on, getting my family into an environment where I felt that I could provide for them in an alternative means rather than, just going to the grocery store, so to speak. And so one of the mistakes that I made, which in hindsight turned out to be not a, catastrophic mistake, is that I didn't ask the real estate agent to look into that. And so, one of the things that I would recommend, if it's at all possible, is that, if you're looking at a property or you just, are considering putting an offer on a property, especially if you're coming in from out of state, you stay an extra day or two and then, go around and knock on doors and just, talk to the neighbors, get to know them. I've actually had people come up to me and do that. A couple of years ago, there was a couple from Seattle looking to purchase a property that was on the market in our area. And, I was out chopping wood and they came up to me and they just started talking to me. And so I would recommend that you do that because you're right. You can't pick your neighbors and it's a big decision and you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you've, really uprooted your whole life, and you go to a place and then you find out that there are one or two people that are just, very difficult to get along with and are going to try and prevent you from doing the things that you want to do as a result of wanting to move there in the first place. And so, but I got very lucky. I was very fortunate because we had a retired police officer, a veterinarian, a hospital administrator, a heavy construction contractor were the 5 or 6 neighbors that were, kind of quote unquote on our side of the mountain. And so it was a very good mix. And it's a little community. I mean, people up there were already preparedness minded. Is that how you say it? Mm-hmm. And so, for example, the gentleman who was the retired police officer, he came over to my house one day and asked if he could come in, and he was asking me questions about, my faith and things of that nature. And he was the one who said, well, there's this gentleman by the name of, James Wesley Rawls, and he wrote this book called The Patriot, and I suggest that you go out and buy that book and read it. And so, that's an example of, how I was singularly focused, but then my focus became much more broad once I got here. And I was very fortunate in that some of the things that I didn't look into and some of the things that I didn't do could have turned out much differently than they did. So I would recommend anybody that's doing that to come up, take a look at the area, see if you can talk to folks, or definitely, press the real estate agent that you're working with to see if they can, gather any information about the potential neighbors that are going to be in the area that you want to move to.
Wow, this has been really helpful. What's next for you? Any big goals ahead that you're got a twinkle in your eye of what you want to do next? Well, I'm not done yet. I mean, we've been up here since 2015, and as I mentioned earlier, the gentleman that we bought the property from was not a preparedness-minded individual. They were up here because they loved horses and they liked horseback riding, and so the property doesn't have a greenhouse. It doesn't have a root cellar. I really need to, make some improvements to the water situation, and that I need to, put in a holding tank and, do some different things. And so, I'm continuing down that path. I have a large list of things that need to be done. It's one of the things that I would recommend, obviously, is you put together a list, kind of like a rolling agenda. And, as you cross things off the bottom, you add things or cross things off the top of the list, you add things to the bottom of the list. And so, in the near future, the next 2 big projects on my plate are, continuing to do the research and build a root cellar, and build a greenhouse, and then kind of go from there. Our children graduate high school next year. So, there's going to be some change there. But, it's just a matter of continually refining, improving, and, deepening your skills in terms of food storage,
you know, moving the property to a potential, survival during a long-term grid down scenario, different things like that are, kind of next on the list, so to speak. And so we've been going at it incrementally, and we're going to continue down that path simply because there's always more to do.
I have to ask this because you mentioned your kids aren't kids anymore. They've grown up. One has more special needs than the other, but they're both graduating high school age. From a generational standpoint or a multi-generational family standpoint, how are your kids and you and your wife facing that as far as you're talking about things you're doing to develop the property and things that you've done. You've done hunting, you've built this, you've done that. Is there any talk in your family about what happens next as far as continuing to live together or splitting up the property or handing it over at some point? Are there any interest on their part or kind of, next stage of family life?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, again, it's a little bit different for us because, our twins are 17 now, and it's quite clear that our son is not going to be able to provide for himself. So we're actually meeting with attorneys because we're going to have to petition the courts to get guardianship over him when he turns 18 in about 4 or 5 months. And our daughter, on the other hand, she's going to be going off to college. She's fully recovered. And so what we're trying to do, we're fortunate in that the property that we own has a guest house on it, or a little cabin. And so our goal is to, hopefully get him to the point where he can start showing that he can live independently. And then the next step would be to move him into the cabin and hopefully, continue to let him develop as we go on the road to recovery. But, from our daughter's perspective, we're at the point now where, what we're trying to do is prepare as best we can so that, when the Lord calls both of us home, she's in the best position possible to take care of him. And we don't want to burden her with that while she's young. We want her to be able to, blossom and go off to college. And she's a competitive dancer, and she's doing very well in that. And so we're trying to get her to go along life's path, so that hopefully, either our son ends up recovering and is able to quote unquote mainstream and becomes self-sufficient, or, we're trying to, set us up in such a way that, he won't be as a big burden onto her if and when that time comes where, she's going to have to, be taking care of him once we're gone.
Feel free to pass on this question if you like, but because we also have the healingyourself.life channel, it's also YouTube/healingyourself. Just curious, as far as it's not that common to have twins with on the autism spectrum. Just wondering, and you were also able to do amazing recovery for your daughter. Wondering if you can share with our viewers if you have any learnings as far as what the root cause may have been, or what the factors may have been, and what the path to recovery, other than clean food, clean water, those things that you've already emphasized.
Yeah, I mean, that's a loaded question, and my wife would be, she would be the expert on that. But we decided very early on that we were going to recover, or going to attempt to recover them, biomedically, and so we made great progress in the very beginning when they were little by getting them off of gluten, casein, going down those paths. We've tried a lot of things for our son, including cord blood stem cell treatments. And so, going through that process and in taking our pediatrician from someone, you got to remember this is now back in 2003, 2004, when they were diagnosed, where our pediatrician basically, once we told him what we thought it was, he thought we were crazy, and going through that whole process of educating and the awareness increasing, and we got blood tests, we got, medical records. We were able to, track down the actual lot numbers of the vaccines and find out what ingredients were in there. And so going through this process, we came to the conclusion that, that our children were vaccine injured, and did whatever we could and worked with various homeopathic practitioners and biomedical professionals to help us on that recovery process. And,
wow.
and so that, for me, logically speaking, if your autistic child has an immune deficiency, first stop the bleeding by not, having them ingest anything that has, toxins, heavy metals, pesticides, hormones, because it is only going to prolong your ability to flush the toxins that are in his system out of his system, right? And so, for us, biomedically was the only option.
Wow. Well, we'll need to follow up more on that topic if we can later. We'll talk more about that offline to
Sure.
see if there's a way we can circle back on that, because that's a whole nother treasure trove of wisdom and learning and struggles and overcoming, seeking your own. A lot of what you've talked about here is about hard physical work, but a lot of it is also hard physical or hard knowledge research that you had to do to identify the right location, connect with the right people, get plugged into the right information so you could make the best choices. We've been speaking with Gus from northern Idaho, who together with his wife and 2 children made the move from Texas to Idaho to become self-sufficient in a large way in providing homesteading for themselves there and gathering their own food and that sort of thing. Gus, it's been a great gift to our viewers. Any parting thoughts before we let you go?
I would like to just reiterate that I really appreciate you agreeing to let me share my story. Obviously, I'm not an expert, and I think that you're doing great work. And I think that the quote unquote alternative media, alternative research, all of these things that are coming out of necessity, so to speak. I think that those are noble pursuits, and I just really appreciate you, agreeing to let me share my story, and hopes that somebody out there might get 1 or 2 nuggets from our discussion today, and hopefully that can be a positive thing, for someone else down the road. Absolutely,
and the gift is from you to us and to all of our viewers. We got 70,000 subscribers across our 2 channels, and there's any number that will be exposed to this and be able to share it, and it will go on, and so the gift will continue to spread. Folks, one way that you can for sure do that right now is by clicking like and subscribe and click the little bell icon so you get notified of new releases. Another way you can support us is by going to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers and becoming one of our supporting community that helps us to do this outreach. There's so many ways. There's so great needs that we can help to meet with you helping us to do that. The most meaningful way that you can do that is by a donation monthly of at least $10, because that will allow us to keep this going and to grow it. We already are trying to do 3 broadcasts a week rather than the 1 or 2 that we did in the past. And lastly, if you would be open to discussing, sharing your story with others, and whatever level of anonymity you'd prefer is just fine, go ahead and email us at reluctantpreppers@gmail.com, and we'll get connected and see if it's a good fit. So Gus in Idaho, and please thank your wife for us, and thanks for joining us this first time on Reluctant Preppers. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. They say the stock market crashed today.
Yeah, I heard that.
Sounds like people's retirement accounts and savings accounts are going to get bailed into the banks.
Yeah.
Looks like pension plans and Social Security are going to get suspended too.
I know.
Sure, I'm glad we decided to put our money into gold and silver instead.
Me too.
Get your gold and silver and support this channel at goldsilver.com/AFF=RP.
Please help us grow by subscribing today at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers.
Reluctant Preppers provides educational awareness and commentary only. Opinions expressed do not constitute personalized financial advice. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and seek qualified personal financial consultation before making investment decisions.